My name's Adrian Spence. I'm the Artistic Director for Camerata Pacifica, and I'd like to welcome my colleagues Derek Katz and James Donelan and Bill Weber. What we're going to look at tonight and over these three talks is what made Beethoven the figure he is. Why does Beethoven have such a hold on us today that we listen to music, how we receive music, how we process music are defined by rules that were established at the start of the 19th century? Why, in the 21st century, are we still listening and programming and responding to those criteria? And this is not, by the way, this is not to diminish the genius of Beethoven, but I'm hoping that what you'll get from this is a much broader understanding of why you're hearing music the way you do. The first quote that I'll start with, it just seemed, I came across this in James' book, Poetry and the Romantic Musical Aesthetic. There you go. This seemed like an appropriate quote from Felix Mendelssohn for what we're about to do. People talk so much about music and say so little. I'm absolutely certain that words are not adequate to it, and if I ever found that they were, I should eventually give up composition. We're going to give it a shot anyway. And James, let's start with you, because reading your book, the philosophical underpinnings, why? Tell us something.
Well, Beethoven and Mozart before him showed up at a particularly opportune moment in the history of ideas. Now, I don't want to claim that Beethoven spent all his spare time reading philosophy or anything like that, but there was a general sense leading up to, from early in the 18th century to later, that something was shifting in the world of ideas. From Newton and John Locke in the late 17th century through to the middle of the 18th century, there was a lot of systematic inquiry into the material world. They were cataloging things. Newton had figured out how objects flew through space. People were compiling encyclopedias. There was a great deal of list making, and it all had a great deal of faith in the idea that an objective observer could use the rational mind to figure stuff out about the world if only he or she could just stay out of the way. To be objective about things, you kind of put the self in the background. And there was an abrupt turnaround in the late 1780s.
Title for that philosophy, you told me at the title.
Empiricism. British empiricism is at the heart of it, but there are empiricists elsewhere as well. British empiricists included Locke, Hume. David Hume believed there was no such thing as a self, that we were just a bundle of nerves at heart reacting to external stimuli, that there was no I inside. It was just an illusion or a shorthand for what that bundle of nerves were. So that's kind of the middle of the 18th century. This comes to a real crashing halt when Immanuel Kant starts looking very systematically inward. He wants a logical, rational, almost mathematical organization for how we think and feel and experience things. So he starts to look into things like logic, consciousness, the experience of beauty, everything that has to do with what goes on inside our minds. And again, trying to find a way to prove things about what happens in our minds that has no reference to the world outside. Because he believes, and a number of philosophers believed after him, that that's where it starts, that we don't have any way to perceive the outside world until we get our ways of understanding, of knowing, of perceiving straight. This is the beginning of idealist philosophy, and it has a very powerful German strain. It starts with Kant and continues with Fichte and Schelling, who was Hegel's roommate, and Hegel too. And really kind of reaches a high point with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Born in 1770, same as Beethoven. So all this is happening in a great confluence, and people are really worrying about these things. They're talking about it a lot. And the result of it, in terms that might affect Beethoven directly, is that the experience of artistic beauty, there's a general category that means both visual art and music and literature, that becomes elevated to really one of the highest forms of human experience, on a par with religious experience. And music, because instrumental music lacks words seems to be kind of the essence of the aesthetic.
All right, so hold on to that. Yeah. We're going to come back to that. But we'll go to a quote from your book, I think is good at this time. So what we have is we're moving from the empiricism to the idea of romantic self-consciousness. Right. And your quote, after Mozart and Kant, theoretical, metaphorical, and actual music converge to create the complex reciprocating matrix of ideas known as romantic self-consciousness. So there's this huge shift. But how does this apply to Beethoven? So when we discussed this and we were doing this, we need to go back to the Enlightenment. We need to look at, so Beethoven, was he a child of the Enlightenment? In Bonn? What about Frederick the Great? What about Joseph II?
Yeah, so I think, as we're situating Beethoven very specifically in Bonn, where he was born, where he grew up, and where he was trained, I think there are a number of things we could profitably discuss. One of them is definitely his relationship to the Enlightenment, the question of to what extent the German Enlightenment was distinct from the French Enlightenment. We might also want to talk about Beethoven's specific relationship to the members of the aristocracy in Bonn. And I think, I'm an amateur musician. I'm very interested in sort of the conditions on the ground for working musicians, talking about what Beethoven was actually doing. What was he playing? What was he hearing? What types of musical training were available to him? What other musicians did he collaborate with? So perhaps, Bill, maybe I could defer to you on the question of the Enlightenment and start us with Beethoven as a child of the Enlightenment in Bonn.
Well, it's partly the difference between different countries. In philosophy, we often think of Enlightenment coming in French context, but by the 1770s, the great men in philosophy are all dying or dead already, and there's great conflict among their supposed successors. And so in France, there is a growing crisis within this field with a sense of no real future and a sense of a derogatory profession. In the period before the revolution, which is one of these mysteries that things were not going well, but very different from the German situation, where, as you can see, as we've heard, it was a growing and formative period in which actually something like music probably can be more closely studied in such relations than in France, where it's much more problematic, or even England.
So Derek said something interesting earlier about, he said, of the French Enlightenment, it led to revolution. So the French Enlightenment and the guillotine are very much together, whereas in the German Enlightenment, there was no threat to
Right, not only was there no revolution, there was no real agitation for a revolution. There was a hope of an intellectual, spiritual, and societal change. There was a hope for a new, more just, more humane world, but that didn't mean an overturning of the aristocratic order. And I think, again, if we're connecting this very closely to Beethoven as an individual, the fact that he was someone who was hoping, if not actually to literally become an aristocrat, but to be able to interact with them on the basis of equality because of his artistic talent, that was in a sense not a revolutionary position at all. He wasn't looking to do away with the aristocracy. He wanted to benefit from them, interact with them as an equal, as an associate.
Yeah. So the term Aufklärung meant something. One can really deal with it in a way that the same is not true in France, and therefore, what in our discussion, the four of us, we've had quite a discussion the last 2 days, this sense of a Beethoven having a sense of a profession that is largely based upon a self-critical method and can be thought of as empirical. He's working in this context, and then some of his interpreters start interpreting him in very different ways. And therefore comes a sense of a difference between what is said about him and what he thought he was doing.
Swafford talks about, when he talks about the French Revolution and Beethoven as a child of the Enlightenment, so he says Beethoven subscribed to the notions of liberty and fraternity, but not at all not at all equality. And you were talking about already in Bonn that he sees himself or sets himself up as an equal to the nobility. And then the key phrase you said, and gets away with it.
This is the amazing thing about Beethoven. He does some extraordinary things intellectually, personally, professionally, and he gets away with it. But perhaps we should have a little bit about Bonn. Mm-hmm. Many people, have you been to Bonn? It was
lots of nods.
a small city, but with great significance. It was very central to the crowned heads of Europe. And in this period, as our good writer shows, it was growing intellectually. There was a library started in 1787, and that Beethoven was very much part of this growing and basically empiricist sense of intellectual growth within that city. But the crucial thing is that it wasn't enough.
But he did benefit very directly from Bonn and specifically from the Enlightenment characteristics of Bonn. So he was amongst the first generation of school children to be educated by an imperial school rather than by the Jesuits. So he was getting a secular Latin education. He had the opportunity to sign up for lectures, which he did not attend at the newly founded Bonn University. And he was also very well connected to these very well connected aristocrats. So the second of the two electors of Bonn for whom Beethoven served, Maximilian Franz, was the brother of Emperor Joseph II. He was the brother of Marie Antoinette. So these are the people that Beethoven was working with, that he was associating with. So yes, it's a small place. It doesn't have that many inhabitants, but culturally, as far as the quality of music, the quality of education, it may not have been enough, but it wasn't such a bad situation in a lot of ways.
So let's hold on to that thought about the connections he had, and let's pick that up in a few minutes. I want to come back to, I've got a few questions here. And from your book, James, there's a quote about the shift from the nobility to, well, the quote, now the intellectuals are the guardians of society. So you've got that shift. And then I want to ask all three of you, in this time in Bonn, Beethoven as a teenager, in this German Enlightenment environment with everything starting to boil, Kant, we quipped Mendelssohn, like, why talking about all this music? But the fact is, Mendelssohn did talk about music a lot, and you talk about Hegel's lectures.
Right. They're enormously influential. They're very popular. Not everyone makes perfect sense out of them, and a lot of people get them wrong. But people are attending lectures by the state philosopher. He's a very well-known figure, and it's influencing them. It's helping them think about art and music in new ways. And they're realizing that a philosopher who is empowered to talk about every subject under the sun, who talks about politics, talks about nature, and the inner workings of the mind, is telling them that the experience of beauty is really the highest form of human experience, and really something very closely allied to what used to be religious experience.
I picked up a quote from Daniel Chua's book from the musicologist A.B. Marx, "Art is reason in sensuous appearance." Here are questions. Was Beethoven aware of the new philosophical currents? Was Beethoven self-aware? Was Beethoven self-determinate when he was a young man in Bonn?
I think he was aware of philosophical currents in broad terms, but the influence of those philosophical currents ran deep, because whenever you, as a creative artist of any kind, sit down to do what it is you do, to compose or paint or whatever, you have an idea of who you are and what you're doing for someone else when you present them with your work. And as that would shift in the culture in general. The philosophers, in a certain sense, are leading the way. And it wouldn't happen universally, and instantaneously, but it was shifting. And I think it had reached Beethoven by way of a lot of the people in Vienna, including Mozart, either when he actually went to Vienna, but also when he heard what was going on there, what the general musical culture was doing in elevating composers to a higher status. Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that we keep on marveling at is the way he sort of just acts very high-handed with people who outrank him in society by a considerable margin.
I was going to say, one of the things I really appreciate about what you're doing, Jim, is you're really delineating some of the different ways in which the influence of ideas can be felt. So if we ask, what did Beethoven know and when did he know it? There's a limit to how precise we can be. Was he actually reading Kant? Probably not. Had he read a summary of Kant? Perhaps. Did he attend lectures about Kant? Probably not. Was he operating in an intellectual environment where he was talking to people about art and politics and taking for granted certain principles about, again, humanity, brotherhood, types of justice? Absolutely. So, I mean, I think, in the same way that we can, think about early 20th century society, we're all living in Einstein's world, even if we can't explain the theory of relativity. That there's these large-scale senses in which we live in an intellectual context, even if we haven't directly engaged with the primary texts.
But an aspect of this is, it's interesting they're born in the same year, because each of them is expanding the significance and the scale of their ideas, musical or philosophical, to a much larger plane, with much more structure to it. And in this respect, well, we got talking yesterday in our first try at this about, as our good leader suggested, Beethoven as an entrepreneur. He is someone who's going it alone to a certain extent, on his own, but he is manipulating other people, just like a businessman. But I would say that it's in a particular intellectual entrepreneurship here. He is getting ideas that he then is spreading to other people. He is influencing them. He's giving a new scale of ideas implied within his music, not born of any knowledge of Hegel, but there's a parallel here. And that this is an extraordinary thing. As you read we recommend this as not just bedtime reading. You keep going in this book, and you get a sense of how of the physicality of how he did this, and the fact that he then goes so far beyond the norm, just as Hegel did.
An interesting thing that Derek said, one of the things that we have to be careful of is that we're viewing everything from the 21st century. And the 21st century, I'm afraid to say, we're looking through the lens established by Beethoven. We're still using we're using that romantic lens that we've been carrying for 120 years, and we're looking back. And we're looking back into Beethoven and Bonn. We look at Mozart and Haydn and Bach with a romantic lens. Derek gave a comment, and I found myself so guilty of exactly what I'm just talking to you about. Because we have our image of who Beethoven is. We've got our stereotype and our caricature. And Derek pointed out where I was like, wow. So we're talking about Beethoven and Bonn when you've got a young, fully hearing man with friends. He's not the misanthropic Beethoven that we know yet.
Yeah, he's wearing a uniform, he's tidily dressed, he's interacting with people his own age and social class, he's collaborating with other musicians in the court theater orchestra, he's playing the organ for the church, he's playing the piano for the theater. He's very functionally interacting with a lot of other people. Although, as he pointed out, he's already sort of branding himself as the maverick, as being different, as being more ambitious, but while also functioning very well in this very normal context.
All right, gentlemen, so take me from Bonn to Vienna. First of all, I want you to establish in Bonn, so Beethoven's a classical composer. Although he's not so much a composer, he's a classical piano player.
Yeah, he's primarily a performer.
And he's networking with nobility that's going to lay the ground for him to go to Vienna. And he's developing his entrepreneurial and branding skills. Bring that together and set us up to go to Vienna.
Just to sort of fill in that classical performer, that role he was fulfilling in Bonn a little bit more, you have to remember that A composer was an artist, was someone with very specific talent and skill set, but also someone who was not necessarily any more elevated than, say, the architect for the Elector's Palace or the landscape designer that designed the grounds. Mozart was in this role as well when he was in Salzburg, and Beethoven was very much in this role where he wore the uniform provided that a servant of this caliber and level would have for the Elector. And when you needed music, Beethoven provided it. And it didn't matter all that much whether he was playing somebody else's music or his own or some combination or some variation. He was the music guy. And that role began to evolve into someone who was talented enough to win a competition against other players, talented enough to come up with his own stuff, his own original stuff. And one of the things we noticed, and don't want to leap too far into Vienna, but when he gets to Vienna, there's a lot of composers around, but there are even more nobles around and aristocrats and wealthy people who are competing for the attention of the best composers. It's a very refined crowd with refined tastes, and they want the best, and they're willing to appeal to these local composers and performers in order to get the status that comes with having the best guy in your household.
And so remember that point, because we're going to bring up Tia de Noor's book
Right.
for that. But let's talk about his classicism in Bonn. Let's talk about his work in Bonn, about his networking.
Oh, can we talk about the classicism in terms of the music? So I'm very glad that you mentioned Mozart, and I think I'm going to end up quoting you in this context. So I think, at the risk of getting too sort of vernacular, you sort of have to ask for a composer, a musician, who does this person want to be when he grows up? And if he's looking around in Bonn, he's surrounded by very high-quality instrumentalists. He's sitting in the same orchestra with arguably the best cellist in Central Europe, Bernhard Romberg, one of the best flutists, Anton Reicha, and other musicians of that caliber. He doesn't have a model as a composer, though. There's no one that can teach him or just through his own life demonstrate what it means to be a composer. So when he starts to write music, the first substantial pieces are 3 piano quartets, pieces for 3 stringed instruments and piano, and they're very closely modeled on Mozart violin sonatas. So I think Mozart is providing a model in at least 3 ways. So one way is Mozart is just teaching him how to get from measure 1 to measure 8. He's looking at the Mozart violin sonata and saying, these are the harmonies that Mozart used, these are the rhythms that he used, these are the relationships between the instruments. This will be my starting point. So there's a very technical sense in which he's building on Mozart. Then there's a larger sense in which, for whatever reasons, the pieces that Beethoven chose as models, those Mozart sonatas, are the first pieces that Mozart wrote when Mozart moved to Vienna, when Mozart was presenting himself as a composer-performer, and pretty much the only chamber music that Mozart wrote to be played with a professional violinist. So Beethoven was immediately beginning with the idea that he was writing for chamber music to be played by professionals, which in 18th century classical context is deeply wrong. Chamber music is for dilettantes, it's for amateurs, it's for civilians, it's for home use. And the third way, and this is where I'm going to toss it back to you, is that Mozart was a model of someone that had taken off the uniform, that had been a court servant, in this case obviously for the Archbishop of Salzburg, and had moved to Vienna and gone into business for himself and made a living in exactly the same ways that Beethoven would make a living when he too moved to Vienna. So that sense of Mozart, I think, as an aspirational goal was present in multiple senses.
Well, part of this, of course, is that what kind of music do you think that most people wanted in any major city of Europe in 1790, 1800? Opera. And what country of the composer would they normally want? Italian. And this is the big challenge to musicians everywhere else. And the French had resisted this. They didn't have anything in the opera by a Frenchman virtually, except for a few occasions, until really it was all French until the 1770s when Gluck came in, you see. And he was a kind of Italianized bohemian. So there's this real problem of what you're going to do. And so therefore musicians from non-Italian countries who are not about to try to do what Gluck did. They basically use virtuosity as their means. Well, it's very clear that Beethoven didn't want to do that. He was be a virtuoso. He was the best pianist in the city. Pretty much proven. He had to go beyond that. And so he basically starts at Bonn putting together notions of a much more deeply rooted and intellectually significant kind of instrumental music. And looking at Mozart, of course. Don't forget, where was Mozart mostly known for? Opera, really. We can't forget that. I'm quite sure that he was looking ahead to what he could do in this sense. He had this huge ambition, and we, as we got talking last time, this sort of intellectual entrepreneurship. But this would mean that at the same time, he would not just write, say, the First Symphony, which really took people aback as being different from the norm. He also wrote all sorts of very popular pieces that we now regard as lesser. He knew he had to do it. He was an entrepreneur. He had to go to public taste. And so it's this period in Bonn where he's planning this. You can see that he probably looked ahead a lot.
So he's going to go to Vienna. How does he get there? Who funds him? Let's talk about Waldstein. And let's take us to Vienna right now. How does he get there? Who funds it? And he didn't go in cold. There were doors open for him. He didn't have to compete the same way as other musicians did.
Well, so he goes twice. He goes once for a short time, funded by the elector, which was normal for the time. If you had a very talented court employee, you sent him, and would be him in those days, to a major site for training. If you would, Max Franz sent his painters to Rome. He would send a musician to Vienna, the idea being that you would study with the most distinguished people in that city, come back to the court and grace the court with the accomplishments you had then honed in the city. You would then decorate the palace with paintings or fill it with the sounds of the music you had composed. The second time when he goes for good, he's funded by Count Waldstein, who had recently taken up residence in Bonn and was extraordinarily well connected. As you say, when Beethoven went, he literally had cards in his pocket. He had cards of introduction, letters of introduction to not so much the major aristocratic families, but the artistically involved aristocratic families, the families that were most likely to be interested in supporting a musician.
So let's go from there to, he's developing entrepreneurship. Let's go from there to this notion that he was able to write because he was protected by. Let's go to how the aristocrats divided themselves into the arbiters of taste as opposed to just presenting concerts. And let's talk about Denora's position where because of that, what are the differences there?
Well, one of the things that's changing about this time is that aristocrats are no longer as important to political life. They're wealthy people, they're still significant and important people, but many more of them are moving to Vienna and really just being kind of people about town with wealthy households. And meanwhile, there's a growing bourgeoisie, nouveau riche, who are aspiring to the level of the aristocrats. And here the aristocrats are trying to distinguish themselves by being arbiters of taste, by being the people who know these things and have developed sophisticated tastes over time. And their role as leaders in culture and intellectual pursuits begins to grow at this point as well. It is something that there actually is a certain kind of anxiety as the French Revolution nears, and that the venality of the French aristocrats is becoming known to those in the German-speaking countries. They're trying to prove themselves to be more and more useful to society at large, and to do it in ways that aren't defined by commerce, because that's what the bourgeoisie are doing. And so this kind of cultural elite builds up. And also many of, or a number of Beethoven's patrons were aristocrats who were visiting from other countries or had ties to other countries, from Russian and all gravitating toward Vienna as a cultural center.
So There's a fabulous book by
Tia Denora.
Tia Denora called Beethoven and the Construction of Genius.
Yeah, and so we're doing a lot of pushing of books today, and so this is one that certainly is very transformative for me in my understanding of Beethoven. And there's a lot to it. One of the things that we found most striking is her comparison of Beethoven with the pianist-composer Jan Ladislav Dušek. Can we assume this is not an extraordinarily familiar name? Hands up, everyone's played a Dušek piano sonata. Good, okay, just checking. But in really short form, what Denora suggests is that had Beethoven moved to London, as Dušek did, at the same time, it's quite likely that Beethoven's career would have looked a lot like Dušek's career, and none of you would be holding up your hands if I asked you if you knew Beethoven's piano sonatas either. So one way of looking at it is that we don't know that if Dušek had come to Vienna, he would have had Beethoven's career, but we can make a very solid argument that if Beethoven had gone to London, he would have had Dušek's career. Or another way of looking at it, that for all of Beethoven's ambition and genius and talent, those things were all necessary to make Beethoven Beethoven, the Beethoven that we know and love, but not sufficient. It needed the proper context, it needed the aristocratic support, it needed the concepts of genius and the particular outlets for music that he found in Vienna.
I think it can be argued that if Beethoven was born 5 minutes earlier, 5 minutes later, we wouldn't be, we're going to discuss that later.
5 miles to the east, 5 miles to the west.
Right,
yeah.
We wouldn't be talking about him today. So we have these aristocrats now that, because of the changes forced on them, the top level in Vienna are now, these are the people that are deciding what is serious music. Exactly. And Beethoven has been adopted by them. And because he's got this protection, he's free to compose in a manner that other musicians aren't able to. He's able to write his own music and develop his own voice. It's going to take us into the heroic period because he doesn't have to be competitive.
Yeah, I think this can't be stressed enough. Perhaps this sounds too obvious that to write serious music is a good thing, but this represents an enormous shift in aesthetic priorities, especially within the context of Vienna at the end of the 18th century. Beethoven was coming out of an era in which it was taken for granted that the highest values were grace and naturalness, and that the most effective role for a composer is to write things that were technically graceful, accessible to the dilettante, but also aesthetically graceful and accessible in that way, again, to the listener who is rational, but not necessarily enormously sophisticated. And then there's this flip at the beginning of the 19th century in both senses, where suddenly to be serious, to be difficult to understand is the most important thing, and in fact to be emotional, to be romantic, which was exactly the mark of the uncultured, irresponsible listener in the late 18th century. In the 19th century, this now becomes the highest value.
But I would add at one point in terms of age, that he's much younger in real significance. When you look at the musicians who made it in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in France, England, Vienna, they're well up into their 60s. And he puts his mark on musical culture significantly. He is influencing it in his late 20s. This is very unusual. And this shows the egotism, but the psychological manipulation that he's able to do to bring people around him and get these opportunities.
And also, his patrons are very young. The
right.
counts and princes
Right.
that are supporting
the women
him are
particularly.
are also in their late 20s and early 30s. So there's it's an impetuous movement of young people who are passionate about new ideas.
Yeah.
And so what about his entrepreneurship?
Well, this is his skillful ability to claim something for himself and do very daring things, whereas at the same time have ins with people to keep from getting hurt by it. And therefore composing something like Wellington's Victory, which everyone wanted to hear, everybody banged out on the piano or the harp. So he managed to play the ends against the middle. And it's part of this adaptive ego.
Also, there is a somewhat of a model in this. When we were talking earlier about him following Mozart's career to some extent, and maybe this is a little too fine-grained, but I think it's 1787, Mozart is in Vienna and does not have as secure a court position as someone of his stature really should. And opera composition, as you said, is the be-all and end-all of composing, but you weren't allowed to compose or put on operas during Lent. So he created piano concertos starring him for that period. And and sold tickets, conducted the orchestra, sat down and played, and it's quite a show. I mean, people do that once in a while these days, where they conduct and play the solo part, and it really is a star turn. That's a wonderful model, and Mozart isn't that much older than Beethoven at this point. That's right. He's still quite young, so that's something a new up-and-coming composer could do, particularly one who was trying to, reestablish himself in a certain sense. I mean, Mozart had been the child genius, and then perhaps not a has-been, I think that's an exaggeration, but I think still felt pangs of longing for when he was so renowned.
Might you say that there's something about Viennese culture that where this could happen that would not happen in Paris?
No, I think that's very much the case. And I want to, if it's okay, I'd like to be a little more fine-grained about the nature of this entrepreneurship. So Vienna, around the beginning of the 19th century, is a place with essentially no public concert culture. There are no standing organizations. It is possible to hire the orchestra of the Burgtheater during Advent, during Lent, and put on concerts as Mozart did. But he's selling these tickets by subscription to a very small number of largely aristocratic patrons. You know, when we talk about these concerto concerts, we should not be imagining a large hall filled by a socially diverse audience of people sort of walking in off the street to buy tickets. We're talking about a small number of people with whom Mozart in this case, later Beethoven as well, already had personal relationships. And even during the year when they were putting on operas in the Burgtheater, it was a very small number of people coming over and over again. The seats were being filled by the same, it was not a big hall to start with, and there were a lot of repeat customers, and they were drawn largely from the upper crust of Viennese society. So yes, it's entrepreneurial, but it's targeted at a very small, very particular audience.
Let's stay with this entrepreneurial thing for just another few minutes, and then I want to move into his compositions and classical or romantic. A phrase that's very popular nowadays is branding. And we've been talking about this the past few days because Beethoven's branding is amazing. Absolutely amazing. And we're thinking, or I've been asking these gentlemen, it's, this idea of this stormy genius who can be rude to his patrons. I'd never get away with that. I'm asking these guys, is this a calculation? Was it Lobkowitz where he stormed out of the room when they wanted him to play with the famous phrase, there are and always will be 1,000 princes, there will only ever be one Beethoven. And so there's times where he does this, and then there's times he miscalculates and oversteps, and he has to write these groveling letters afterwards.
And gets away with it. But the brand, right up to the deafness, is perfect branding. Like I've said, Nike would have signed him like that.
Well, as far as calculation is concerned, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that was his real personality. He thought a lot of himself. But it is interesting to note there are little hints here and there of a kind of striving, where this is born out of insecurity. They've noticed a few spots where he very subtly changes the middle letter in Van Beethoven, a very common element of a name in Western Germany, to von Beethoven, to sort of create a fake noble line of Beethoven's. And it's also pretty clear that he did want to marry upward, never succeeded, and that he was trying to become part of their circles in a way that was driven by some kind of inner need. I mean, even these apologies, which are, groveling, I'm so very sorry. If you look at them closely, they're from the point of view of, because we're such good friends, and because we have I have such deep affection for you, and because we're so close. It's not because I've offended you, my Lord and Master.
Yeah, they're not obsequious.
Yeah. Whereas, we were talking about this a little earlier, there's a letter from Johann Sebastian Bach to, I think, the Margrave of Brandenburg, that it seems so over the top that it's really hard to imagine anyone writing it at all. If Your Majesty would accept such a humble contribution from a lowly composer such as myself, it really sounds like that. And it just goes on and on and on. And he's handing them these magnificent works as a kind of audition. And that's not much earlier.
But along with this is a very careful self-criticism. You see, only at this time did it come about the notion of opus or ope, of works. And it isn't just the first piece you wrote, which sometimes was followed, but increasingly, and particularly in Beethoven's case, there was a choice of what will be your first work. And you would not, he delayed a long time before he assigned a piece. And there are these 3 piano trios, 3 strings and a piano. And they were opus 1, and 3 of them. And this, in a sense, is more of this entrepreneurism. He was by this time well known, and they looked at these things, they just simply read them and said, oh my heavens, where are we? You know, this is his first work, and look what he's done. But this he became known for.
I think the Opus 1 is fascinating for the reason that you brought up. It's his conscious gesture, here I am, here is my first published work. But it's also fascinating for what we mean by publish. So one might think publishing one's Opus 1 means a publisher buys it, it goes on the shelves of music shops, people buy it. Not quite. So the publication was sponsored by Prince Lichnowsky, probably in multiple senses. So Beethoven contracted with Artaria, the publisher, for the right to sell it himself. So he paid Artaria to print the copies. Beethoven had the right to sell up to 400 copies on his own. So he got the copies, he sold them at an inflated price by subscription. After he'd sold as many copies as he could, Artaria bought the plates back from him and then sold further copies abroad. But we know exactly how many copies Beethoven sold and to whom he sold them. He sold 245 copies, which to me does not sound like a very big number for a publication, for a first run. But that's 245 copies to 122 people. So that's an even smaller number. And of those 245 copies, 49 of them went to either Prince Lichnowsky or his relatives. So, you know, it comes down to, you know, again, a very small number of people making a disproportionate contribution. And so published doesn't quite mean what we might think of in a more capitalist context.
Okay, we need to move on.
All right.
We need to move now to his music. And Beethoven's a classical composer. And I wonder, had he continued in the manner that we're discussing, would he truly have escaped the shadow of Mozart and Haydn? I doubt we'll be talking about him today in the manner that we do. If we go back to the topic that James first brought up, we've arrived at the notion of self, at self-consciousness and this sweep of romanticism. So, gentlemen, how does this child of the Enlightenment, this classical composer, become the poster boy for the Romantic movement? And how does that affect his music and the perception of his music?
We've been toying with this idea of what if, for any number of reasons, Beethoven's stylistic development had stopped at various points, that, you know, just before the Eroica Symphony or something like that. Would we be talking about him at all, or would we be talking about you know, this great triumvirate of classical era composers, you know, Haydn, Mozart, and their slightly younger, slightly noisier friend Beethoven? It's kind of a strange thought experiment. But one of the factors that enters into this is that, and this is a little further on in time, is that as he starts going deaf, he begins to realize that his career as a performer is ending, and that he's going to have to do something that is unprecedented in the history of major composers, which is to rely entirely on music sales. Now, as Derek just described, he's got this remarkable, clever ability to manipulate his publisher and his patrons with printed music sales. So At this point, he needs a brand. At this point, he needs to have it unmistakable that when you look at a piece of Beethoven's works, you know that that is by Beethoven. As soon as you play it on the piano, you can hear it. So that the stylistic characteristics begin to take on an individual personality. A very vivid Beethoven image comes as soon as you start playing, or as an orchestra starts playing. And is it coincidence that it's the exact moment that the philosophical notion of self-consciousness is really taking over philosophy? Yes and no. Yes and no. It was certainly in the air, and it would certainly found a ripe audience. I think
You guys can't agree with that. Come
No,
on.
I don't. Yeah.
Yeah, good man. I just-
So
There you go.
I'm going to take the contrary position, which I think will make me no friends, that there is no opposition between classical and romantic, that Beethoven had both elements from the very beginning. And I mean this in two senses. In the philosophical sense, Beethoven was a child of the Enlightenment, but he was also a child of German Romanticism. So he was the same age as Hegel, but he was also roughly the same age as E.T.A. Hoffmann, born in 1776, or of Schlegel, for that matter. So all of the great German Romantics were born within about 5 or 6 years of Beethoven. So in that sense, he was growing up with these ideas. At the same time, he was growing up with the ideas of the Enlightenment that we view as more classical. In a musical sense, I think that those expressive registers, the turbulent, difficult, minor key music, which seems to speak to us, as E.T.A. Hoffmann would say, of infinite longing, of those realms beyond those which we can perceive, that's there from the very beginning. Even before he publishes music, he has access to that register, which Mozart really didn't. And again, if you compare...
But it's still classical. It's still
But
sonata
that's my point.
form,
It's
and
always both. He
No,
was
but it's
both
not
from-
romantic.
You can't just say no. You've got to back it up with something.
But you can't possibly say that Beethoven's writing this is the ego on the page. It's an exercise in form and harmony.
Well, of course it is, but I mean, the arch romantic E.T.A. Hoffmann goes on and on about the purple shimmering vistas and the access to truth and beauty and the infinite longing, but he also tells you how to get from bar 1 to bar 4 and where the modulation of the dominant goes when he talks about the breast needing breath and suffocating in the Fifth Symphony. He points out that it's a series of diminished seventh chords.
But this is
It's
Hoffmann
always
putting it
about...
on.
But it's always the two things at once. It's the musical structure, the form, the relationship of the part to the whole, and the infinite longing, and the
Bill,
purple shimmering.
Challenge Derek, for goodness sake here.
I must admit, I have a hard time making up my mind.
What was it? I used to be indecisive, but
Sometimes
I'm
I'm
not
not entirely sure whether the concept of classical works that well with music, because we have such complicated implications, sets of implications for that, our own musical aspects, versus then when you put in a poetic aspect or not. It all depends where you are in the range of his performance when you get to the Ninth Symphony. I'll never forget when I was in 11th grade, a small music class, my instructor looked at us and said, "Don't forget that Ninth Symphony is terrible."
I want to talk about musical criticism, because one of the things that we'll refer to here, and if I've got your email addresses, I'll send you a link, but musical criticism was a recent advent on the scene. And there was this huge article by a chap called E.T.A. Hoffmann, which really placed Beethoven as this romantic composer. But where I'm disagreeing with Derek is it's all Hoffmann's notion of what this was. I don't believe Beethoven wrote that Eroica with that. But let Bill go with his musical criticism introduction here.
Well, it's a major change in the whole intellectual framework of music, that you hadn't had much written about music until really the Germans started sort of in the 1720s, 30s. It's very relaxed. It moves all over the place. A lot of it's about what's happening in Berlin or Frankfurt today. They then, by the 60s, are starting actually to have pieces where there is somewhat formal criticism. The French are slower at this. I'm working on this right now, and I find they really don't start doing it until the 1780s, really. It's a tricky business, music criticism. Basically, it's a pulling back from the larger sort of gossipy realm of musical journalism. People mostly went for musical journalism for gossip, into certain very specific things where criticism, positive as well as negative, can be broached with a certain political safety. And this is a major change. As I say, the Germans started, the French come along, and it's in serious decline right now, as you all know.
And also, just to dig a little deeper into this and some of the connections between German music criticism and other larger philosophical concerns, there were a couple of publications, we were talking about them earlier. One was based in Leipzig and put out by a music publisher itself as kind of a guide to whether you wanted to buy the stuff. It was a little bit like a catalog, the Amazon.com of music. What does this piece sound like when you play it? And
How difficult will it be to play?
Should you buy it?
Should you buy it? It gets 4 stars from me. That kind of thing. This became even more sophisticated, and they had people who were expressing quite highly developed philosophical views about music in these publications and elsewhere.
In terms of criticism, his music wasn't universally appreciated. People hated his music. And we talk about, and Hegel
Hegel didn't like him, no.
Goethe didn't like him.
Right. So this guy was going off by himself, but
Well,
it wasn't well
that
received.
actually is an advantage too on a certain plane. This is the whole nature of the intellectual entrepreneurship of his career, that being criticized did him good.
But also, I'm sorry, I'm going to make even fewer friends than I have before. I like to push back a little more. I mean, he got mixed messages from the criticism. He certainly received specific criticisms of specific pieces which he felt were unwarranted. We have letters from him to Breitkopf and Hertel saying, sort of, call off your dogs, talk to reviewer A, talk to reviewer B, tell him to be nicer to me. On the other hand, the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, the journal that we're talking about, treated Beethoven as qualitatively different from other composers of the time. He was recognized as an important figure who required special treatment, even if that specialness sometimes took the forms of technical or intellectual difficulties that the reviewers felt were inappropriate. So these criticisms, distinctions between pieces, between movements of pieces, were in the context of taking Beethoven very seriously. So, and again, the idea of Beethoven as kind of someone who had been rejected by society or by the critical profession as being too difficult, I think that it's more complicated than that.
I'm going to give a quote from your book again, because I think it works right at this moment, and we can take it from there. James says, to claim that words are inadequate, to go back to the Mendelssohn quote that we opened with, to claim that words are inadequate to music, then to describe the experience of music in many words, resulted from both the intellectual atmosphere of the era and Beethoven's deliberate compositional strategies, which led to the formation of an idea of music as the highest expression of romantic self-consciousness.
Compared with what?
Painting, poetry.
Higher than what happened in regard to romantic poetry?
Well, I like romantic poetry too. It's got a couple of chapters in the book. But what I was referring to actually is the estimation that a number of philosophers at that time had for it. And I mean, Hoffmann, makes that claim. Schopenhauer as well. A number of others. Hegel actually put poetry slightly above music for reasons that are unclear. It's where he gets a little fuzzy. I'm actually thinking about writing a book called Smart Philosophers with Tin Ears. Because they write these wonderful, profound things on the philosophical level, and then when they get to their specific choices and tastes, it's like, well, that's not very good there, Emmanuel.
But Hegel's comment
chapter on
highlighted the split between Beethoven and Rossini.
It did. He alludes to a running debate about whether Beethoven was better than Rossini. Now, in terms of who's high art or something, we tend toward Beethoven. I mean, the conference is about Beethoven rather than about Rossini. But it was a live debate in that time, and in the end, Hegel comes out on the side of Rossini, but only because he just seems to like the tunes better. He doesn't find it very defensible. One of the things that sort of the interaction between philosophy and the actual practice of composing music or painting a painting is that was an idea of what is the most sort of unadulterated, pure, absolute experience of beauty. For these idealist philosophers and critics, it was the experience of something that had no reference to anything outside itself. Now, there's been a lot of critique of the notion of absolute music. That's what they called it, because it's not as absolute as you think. Music has connotative and denotative aspects that we're neglecting, but it's called Symphony Number 2 or whatever. It's not descriptive of anything else. It's not dependent on any external concepts, and therefore we're left free to simply let the sound in and of itself wash over us. Later philosophers and music theorists have kind of pulled apart this concept of absolute music. One particularly interesting critic, Lydia Gurr, is coming and giving being on one of the panels later in the series. But at that time, if you wanted the pure experience of beauty, music was the particular art.
So first of all, I'm going to hit you again. He's a classical composer. He's not a romantic composer. You look, Jeremy Denk says of the late works, by the late years, an uncanny duality develops. On the one hand, the sense that Beethoven might do anything harmonically, that he would venture to the far ends of the musical earth. On the other, always there, rock solid, the triads, the tonic, the dominant, and the familiar landworks of classical harmony and sonata form. You look at, I suggest to you that Hoffman and people are pasting their notions of what Romanticism is onto this absolute music. He didn't write program music. We talk about the Sixth Symphony, and we talk about that harkening back to classical forms, not to romantic forms. And then let me give you these quotes from Mr. Chua, and then go at it. So talking about absolute music, Daniel Chua says, the curse of musical autonomy is its meaninglessness. Absolute music has no meaning. And Scott Burnham says, it's an arbitrary vessel. Absolute music is a tune waving in the winds of our Western world as a blank flag awaiting the colors of a cause. And one more, which I really like, from Michael Steinberg. Beethoven is, in other words, a hero without a cause.
Well, this goes in many directions at once. The notion that absolute music is kind of a blank slate onto which we project our wishes and desires, there is somewhat of a point to that. But on the other hand, there's a rough consensus on a number of works of absolute music, particularly ones by Beethoven, about at least a general sense of its connotation, rather than, that there isn't a specific way to interpret the Third Symphony, the Fifth Symphony, but there are some pretty clear indications in the Third Symphony in particular that there is a kind of heroic figure being described. And that's where we get to the other question, is the hero without a cause. Well, the cause is the autonomous self. And this is something that I think you can track over the course of Beethoven's career, is that he has a notion of himself as the performer and the brilliant composer, more brilliant than anyone else, the one and only Beethoven, a kind of egotistical version of himself that is represented in the works, and that evolves into the heroic version. And then evolves into something that is, just to hint at what I think the late works are about, something that is somewhat self-critical, where he looks back on the past of music, he looks through a number of musical forms, and creates a kind of critique of the heroic self. Now, perhaps that's my projection. This is called Beethoven, intellectual hero. Mm-hmm. But I think it's borne out by a look both at the broader currents of the time that might have influenced him, and the musical form itself. And one of the points that Derek has been making very well, this is you can interpret these tremendous romantic elements, and you've been making the point that no, sonata form's right there. There's the A theme, there's the B theme. But that's actually what is most interesting about him, and I think what's most powerful about him is that he manages to exist in this very classical, symmetric, interesting formal realm, where he has a lot in common with Mozart, and yet conveys that powerful sense of identity and of the heroic composer genius that pretty much everyone perceives when you hear it. It's hard not to hear it.
Derek.
So
Yeah, I agree with that. So, I mean, I don't want to sort of continue the classical versus romantic fight. I mean, basically, I would prefer not to use the words classical or romantic, period. But I think, I like the direction that you're going. And I guess, for me, the key thing for Beethoven is this combination of related elements. One is, I think, what you're talking about, the structure, the tonic and dominant, this structural intelligibility that runs throughout his entire career, but an intelligibility which is tempered by constant experimentation, by pushing of boundaries, by trying of new combinations, by ringing different changes, and the third element, these musical topics, these senses of sort of imminent or possible meaning, even when he's not writing program music, even when he's not telling us a specific story, this sense of communicating something too deep, too important, to be put into words or to be reduced to a single story.
Particularly in the late works for piano and string quartet, which I find simply to call them romantic as opposed to classical misses the point. He's moving off the plane of the composer who is out there in the functioning world, and that changes things fundamentally.
Say that phrase again. That was a fabulous phrase. He's moving off
the plane essential to musical culture, which is interaction with other people. He is entirely within his own frame, and musical culture is intrinsically interpersonal, and he was no longer interpersonal, and so. The fact that it's romantic is, I think, misses the point. It's something that very strange things that very few people liked for a long time, except for certain specialists. And a lot of people still can't quite take it.
Yeah, including some of the most, sensitive and committed musicians of the time. Yeah. Couldn't come to terms with the late works, absolutely.
We've got a good bunch of questions.
Interesting question, especially in view of the destabilizing conflicts mentioned in the notes for tonight's panel. Why did the panel spend so little time on the world of politics, action, and war in which Beethoven socialized and wrote? We've been trying to work at this from a couple of angles, which are philosophical ones and those from the world of the composer, the working composer, and his immediate concerns. And yeah, I would say that it was fair. It's a fair call to say that we left some of the political dimensions out of the mix. Is there a way to work them back in? What do you think?
Well, sure, I was going to say, I don't want to sound defensive again. I think it's a very fair question, but I think it also comes to a certain extent out of the decision to focus on the earliest portions of Beethoven's life and on his music. This is not yet the Beethoven living through the age of Napoleon, not yet the Beethoven who is hiding in the basement, covering his head with pillows to muffle the cannon shots.
These guys are.
It is the Beethoven who's.
You're politicians. You're incredibly evasive. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about hiding in the basement with pillows over the head. He grew up in constant war. Bonn was occupied, and later Vienna was a Metternich.
The whole side of the Rhine was taken over by Napoleon.
Right. So let's take 5 minutes and look at that. Who wants that?
Well, I think it's the flip side of the being so well connected with the aristocracy. On the one hand, as he came to Vienna, he had this receptive crew of aristocrats to support him, but that very structure was then immediately threatened, most specifically by Napoleon, but in a larger sense by the French Revolution, and he had to deal with the practical consequences, everything from currency devaluation and inflation in the wake of the wars with France, to the specific personal affront of the noise and the armies, to a specific career setbacks, such as the first performances of what we now know as Fidelio being performed in front of an audience of entirely uninterested French soldiers. It had enormous consequences for him. The society that had been supporting him was under fairly literal attack.
I mean, two sort of points on it. Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, was very famously dedicated to Napoleon, and then the dedication was removed. There are stacks of books and articles written about that particular moment when he takes the dedication off. But the idea of a military hero being underneath that symphony, being that heroic plot we hear, is certainly present in the literature and in our minds. But also one of his most commercially successful works while he was alive was one called Wellington's Victory. And Bill has some interesting opinions on that particular piece. It's not very widely performed now.
Because you regard it as people call it a potboiler, which is a mistake. It was something that people enjoyed a great deal, just as we enjoy band concerts. No, basically he was writing something for their equivalent of a band concert. Don't forget that there are many people who regard band concerts as a very serious thing. People listen at most band concerts. So I think that it's a potboiler is a very serious mistake.
And is it a political discussion if we look at the leadership of Frederick the Great and Joseph II? Is that, and Maximilian? Is that
No, I think so. I mean, we've been speaking of sort of the spirits of the time, or speaking of Germany, but if we're going to get more local, Beethoven was in a specific area, both of time and of place, that was liberal and reformist in the context of its surrounding times and places. So, by virtue of living through the era of Joseph II, which on the other hand was a time of reform, but it was also a time of reforms that were resisted and resented by much of the population. But there were also reforms that were very much reflected by the reign of his brother in Bonn. So Beethoven was being surrounded by particularly liberal ideas, and I think that's important.
I've got one that's very interesting. Ray, autonomy of inwardness of the late period. Quote, B moves off the plane of musical culture, unquote. Access to an inward genius. Is there some sense to us regarding Beethoven as a mystic? Beethoven as a mystic. I think that's a very good point on a certain plane. And a mystic is someone very wrapped up in her or himself, but yet communicating with people outside in a problematic, disjuncted way.
One of the things I think that this comment or observation touches on is that, and I think there's another card like this who's saying that we're very much intellectualizing the music. That we're looking at ideas and the relationship to the music and even into particularities of the compositional style and everything. And one of the things that we're leaving aside is that none of us would bother if there weren't something incredibly powerful and moving about the music. That there's something about the experience that all these people who work on aesthetics and music theory can't quite describe as why it gets us so much, why it matters so much to us. And I mean, I'm broadening the definition a little bit, but there is something mystical to that. We believe in it. We're appreciators of Beethoven on that level. And there are interesting works out there of people who are writing about the connection between musical experience and religious experience. People who are writing interesting scholarship in theological seminaries about the connection between what they call first-order religious experience and music. Some of it is written from the point of view of very deep believers, but it's still interesting stuff, and even from the point of view of someone who is not necessarily of the same religious persuasion, is that there's a connection here, and I think that it's worth revisiting.
Yeah, the question that you've alluded to about, are we taking something that is about beauty and intellectualizing it, is something that I feel a lot of personal discomfort about. And I'm certainly aware of the fact, as a person, as a teacher, that the music I care most about is the music I found most difficult to talk about, and particularly to teach. In any kind of survey course, when it gets particularly to the late Beethoven works, it just, the importance of the works, their meaning to me, to other musicians, seems to be beyond words in a way that's much more difficult to deal with than so much of the surrounding music. I feel that as a very strong tension.
I think the intellectualization of that, or the mysticism, or the reason we've got a 2-year Why Beethoven project, or the reason we're having these talks, is not so much to analyze or take apart the music, but why does it have such an impact on us today? Why are we so moved buy this music? Why do these guys buy tickets and show up to talks like this? From a guy that was born in 1770, the impact is so contemporary.
So can I answer that with another question?
All right.
So this is another very good, actually this is two very good questions. I'm just going to read the first one. And by the way, very high marks for penmanship from all of you. So following instructions, yes, this is beautifully printed. But it is a really thought-provoking question. If there had not been a Beethoven, in some alternate universe, wouldn't have other composers written compositions in the early 1800s that would be considered radical and revolutionary, with radical and revolutionary in scare quotes. So I love counterfactuals. I love speculation of that sort. And I mean, one way to rephrase the question might be, if there hadn't been a Beethoven, would we have had to have invented him anyway? And, you know, my initial personal reaction, with which I hope people are going to strongly disagree in a moment, is yes, even if there hadn't been a Beethoven, we would have had to have constructed him anyway, that there were such strong intellectual forces looking for a reason to privilege instrumental music at the expense of vocal music, to privilege German music at the expense of Italian and French music, to privilege seriousness at the expense of grace, to privilege the sublime at the expense of the beautiful, that some other figure would have been found around which those ideas would have coalesced.
And would that or would
On
that?
the other hand, if the question is, would someone else have written the works that had the same musical characteristics that Beethoven did? You know, do we imagine a Vienna without Beethoven in which Hummel writes works that sound like the Beethoven works that we know? I tend to think not. I tend to think that the particular works that Beethoven wrote are such distinctive characteristics of such a large collection of contingent factors, personal, political, philosophical, that you couldn't come up with the same results again. You couldn't run the same experiment again and get the same results.
And he's part of that need to be fulfilled, the need of the Romantic movement to have a musical expression.
Question 2, was the Romantic period of music inevitable given the ideas of that time?
All right, I wrote those questions. No, I didn't.
No wonder the handwriting's so good.
I actually on the side of no. We wouldn't necessarily have needed to invent him in quite the same way. I once heard Leon Plantinga, a wonderful Beethoven expert, one of my old professors, say that music history makes a lot more sense if you leave Beethoven out. And I've been wondering exactly what he meant by that ever since, and he said it years ago. But I think what he was talking about is that when you trace things like the classical era and stylistic schools and things like that, it's a lot easier if you just skip Beethoven, even as influential as he was.
Right, I think it's both the evolutionary versus revolutionary question and what Bill was saying about leaving the plane of collaborative music making, that so much of Beethoven is about Beethoven. If you're trying to tell a story about music, capital M, that is somehow shifting in response to the times and social forces, Beethoven doesn't work all that well.
I start to wonder what other composer like Stravinsky or JSB. In some ways, JSB even more than Beethoven. I don't know. That could be, you could have a marvelous parlor game along these lines, a productive, intellectually productive parlor game.
Also, I mean, there's an analogy to history. I mean, when you think of major world historical figures, the great man theory of history has long since been discredited. History is far more complex than the biographies of the great men who make great decisions. On the other hand, there are moments in history where all the social forces and everything would not have taken on the same set of events and same character had there not been a distinctive figure with a distinctive set of abilities and propensities stepping into the fore. And I think that's what we've got with Beethoven, is that he not only, sufficient ability, but extraordinary. Not just the best composer of his generation, but a once in a century sort of thing. I mean, another analogy is as you think about, the high Renaissance in painting, three amazing figures in one time period, contemporaries, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Da Vinci. And there's something different about that grouping and about each of them that is not just that was the best representatives of a particular moment or a particular style, but something that was a real turning point. And I think we've got a similar grouping here.
I mean, I suppose if one wanted to make a counter-argument, you could look at the sciences and look at the many times that major discoveries have been made more or less simultaneously by different figures and suggest there's a certain sort of redundancy built into the system. Had there not been a Darwin, we would have been just fine with Wallace. The Abbé Lemaitre got Hubble's law published before Hubble published it. You know, there are a number of examples like that, so perhaps there's something similar in the arts.
You seem to see all music as intellectual tone poems rather than as beautiful, sensual experience. That's basically saying you're too damn academic. And that's a good point.
Guilty, as charged.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think that it goes back to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier, is that we are trying to figure something out, and that does tend to push things in an intellectual direction. Maybe this is an academic's prejudice, but I just can't imagine that it would be interesting to hear me talk about how swell I think everything is, you know? And we do. I mean, we really do appreciate this. And one of the things that academics rarely talk about, it's kind of our dirty secret, is that, you choose a field and a specialization within a field because you love that thing. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's what you want to spend your life thinking about. And when you go to get a job as a professor, you explain how it was the most logical conclusion that anyone could ever come to, that this was the thing that the world needed studied, most. But it's not true at all. It's because you wanted to study it. I chose actually Opus 130 as the focus of a chapter in the book, and I spent 25 years with it, from the start of the idea to the submitting it to the publisher.
Book on what?
On the late, that one.
Right.
I mean, it did start as an idea I had senior year in college, and with fits and starts and 2 children and a job or 2, it took about 25 years. You can't spend 25 years with something you don't love very deeply, and you have to be able to listen to it a few times.
But also, this is one of the fundamental approaches for Camerata Pacifica, that from the start, one of the axioms has been to treat intelligent people intelligently, and I never program down to you or play down to you, and I expect you to lean in and listen, and if you don't want to, leave. Because what we have here is Aaron Copland's quote, one of the glories of mankind. I regard us all, this collective, this community that the Camerata has drawn together, as stewards of this art form. You'll have seen me write to you about this. And we collectively have a responsibility to hand it off to the next generation better than we received it. And this I feel as a real responsibility. And I think if we get into this music, because this is one of our great achievements as a race, you invest 1, the return is 10. And the more you know about this, the more amazing the music is. My hope is, after these talks, when you come and hear the Beethoven sonatas we're doing next week, it's going to be more. And it's going to bear more of a relationship to the other piece in that program is Steve Reich's Different Trains. So, as James said, the reason we're here is not to intellectualize it, but because we love it that much. We've devoted our lives to it.
To what degree do you think the abuse Beethoven suffered at the hands of his father affected the volatile nature of his music and his personal relationships? I mean, I guess the obvious answer is we don't know. It's not provable. Certainly, I think it's impossible to believe it didn't have an effect on his personal relationships. I mean, it's a familiar, sad story. He was physically abused by his father. He physically abused his nephew when he took over custody later in life, and it's hard to believe that didn't affect his romantic relationships as well. The link to the music seems plausible, but that would be, I think, a more difficult conversation to speak about with any degree of precision.
But you read Swafford's book, and his, I mean, a constant theme. No matter what you read about Beethoven, there's a constant cry for affection. And maybe this is me inserting a program onto his music, but it seems when you listen to his music that he fully understood who he was as a person. He couldn't translate that into an easy fit in society, but you play his music, or you hear his music, and you go, this guy understood what problems he had.
A lot of what we've been doing is looking at the music as a way of finding some way into Beethoven's inner life. And inner life is inevitably something to do with one's family and one's parents. And if I can draw an analogy, maybe this will sound crude in some way, but if you think about the influence of his teachers and the relationship he has with his teachers, which in a way is a kind of father-son relationship, particularly because his father was, also a court musician. He has this way of struggling with them and arguing with them. And you look back at even Nefe and Albrechtsberger. And yet when you look even at the latest works, they're looking back toward his teachers again, wrestling with counterpoint. I think there's even something that he went and found his old counterpoint exercises late in life to do some of the contrapuntal stuff that he does in the late works. So, I don't know, maybe that analogy works.
The relationship with Haydn?
Yeah, Papa Haydn.
That was a complex relationship also, a love-hate relationship. Gentlemen, I have a question. Revolutionary or evolutionary? Bill, you're going first because we're all looking at you.
I don't know, they're both too pat.
You just don't play along, do you?
Well, but particularly what I got an increasing sense of in the late works is that it's a very special kind of thing, and it's not revolutionary by any means. It's a person looking into himself with a mystical sense to other people at a certain few moments. Even evolutionary is a little. It doesn't capture the violence of how he was going about his early career, not violence, but the quirky and explosive ways he was dealing with people and all this, which this book, well, these two books, but particularly this one, really show.
Well, I'm going to go with revolutionary. And actually, I'm going to base it on something you said before about Beethoven, particularly in the late style, leaving behind the plane of an earlier mode of composition, that he changed the relationship between the composer and the audience by becoming more inward directed, by really having it be about working things out for himself and issues in composition that were really for him alone, and we get to overhear it.
But except I normally think of revolutionary as people who are out in the public and interacting with the public, and he's not interacting with the public in this. As this writer of one of my comments said, he's a kind of loudmouth. Well, he's a kind of occasionally articulating mystic.
I'd say that maybe the revolutionary act is a revolution within, that he turns away from the external world and really, he kind of steps out of a style as a particular moment in time. There are throwbacks and leaps forward in the late style that are really hard to reconcile. And that's really something extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I was also thinking revolutionary in the terms of, if you think about the French Revolution, the American Revolution, that some of the most bold statements, sort of pro-revolutionary statements, are the ones where, for instance, like Thomas Paine, who was engaged in both the American and the French revolutions, simply denies that you have any obligation toward the past. Now, Beethoven doesn't quite do that. He's constantly wrestling with the past. But he is stepping into a new world. He's doing something absolutely new in a certain sense when he goes to the late style.
Yeah, I'm sort of with Bill on this one. I want neither evolutionary nor revolutionary. I want outlier. I think to a certain extent that's why we care about him so much, is that he's not on the scale at all.
Right.
And,
This is not what you were hired for. Yeah. Did you read the topic, for goodness sake? Do you not mark people down in class if they don't answer the question?
Yeah.
Outlier, that's a good term.
I'm just slapping this show.
The only problem with outlier is it doesn't express the rage involved. There's a certain rage, which I would not call revolutionary. It's internal. It's so internal, therefore it's not revolutionary.
Oh, would I get another chance to fulfill the terms of my contract? No, to me it's a very serious issue because I think in talking about and teaching music history, to me there's a very strong tension between two things. One is a story about a sort of general practices of music. If we were going to really talk about music writ large at a given time, we wouldn't be talking about the outliers. I mean, the reason to a certain extent that we care so much about Johann Sebastian Bach, we care so much about Mozart, we care so much about Beethoven, we care so much about Stravinsky, is because they're so incredibly peculiar. They're so incredibly unlike the things going on around them. They fit so poorly into the stories about the commercially successful music, the music which is being widely disseminated and played. So if we really want to tell a story, the types of stories which you've told effectively in your books about the development of a middle class, the development of a concert culture, then we spend our time talking about opera, about domestic music, about virtuoso music, exactly the stuff that Beethoven has held up in opposition to. It's not just that he's better than Rossini. Rossini is a decadent, threatening, corrupting influence on the purity of what Beethoven has done. And this is why we go back to the outliers rather than talking about the composers that were truly typical, truly popular, truly successful in a commercial sense.
I'll leave you with one more quote from this fabulous book. Few artists of any kind create without the idea that they are somehow, to some degree, constructing some of themselves into their work. That self can only come to consciousness through an articulate voice. And the sound of what is secret, as Wallace Stevens says, is the sound of each individual voice saying, I am I, to each of us. It is a sound that keeps speaking. And when it speaks, we hear the music of Beethoven. Gentlemen, it has been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much
Very
for having
much
us.
indeed. Thank you very much.